Some messages are expected, some bring bad news, but what happens when a letter arrives that turns your entire world upside down? Stay with us as we unravel a story of mystery, revelation, and the choices that define us. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Jake Callahan's routine was simple. Mornings started with black coffee, eggs, and a few strips of bacon sizzling in his cast iron pan, the grease crackling in a way that felt familiar, predictable. Ever since retiring from the Marines, he had learned to appreciate the quiet rituals of civilian life. No more chaotic deployments, no gunfire echoing in the distance, no sandstorms swallowing the horizon. Just the sound of his radio humming some classic rock, the smell of breakfast, and the distant rustling of the Texas wind through the trees outside his cabin. The letter sat on his kitchen table, unopened. It had arrived the day before, but Jake hadn't touched it, a plain white envelope with no return address. His name was written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. He didn't get much mail. Occasional junk flyers, utility bills, and the rare letter from an old Marine buddy, usually checking in or sharing a memory from the past. But this was different. Something about it sat wrong with him, like a piece of intel dropped on his desk before a mission. A sense that whatever was inside was about to shift everything. Jake finished his meal, wiped his hands on a napkin, and finally picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his calloused fingers, feeling the weight of it, almost like he could sense the gravity of what it carried. A deep breath. Then, with practiced precision, he slid a knife under the flap and tore it open. The letter was a single page. The words were short, deliberate, but they hit harder than any battlefield explosion. "You don't know me, but I think you should. My name is Luke. My mother's name was Emily Carter. She told me you're my father." Jake read the words again, then again. His grip tightened, the edges of the paper crinkling in his hand. Emily Carter. A name he hadn't heard in over 20 years. Memories surged forward, fast and disorienting. He saw her face, long auburn hair, deep green eyes, that playful smirk that always made him shake his head. It had been a short-lived romance during his early years in the service, back when the world was still wide open and he thought he had all the time in the world. He remembered the last time he saw her, standing outside a dusty bar, her arms crossed, telling him she understood why he had to leave, but not to expect her to wait. He had respected that, and like so many things in his past, he had left it behind. But this wasn't something you just left behind. He sat back in his chair, running a hand through his short graying hair. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, but his face remained still, unreadable, just like it had been in every firefight, every impossible situation he had ever faced. But this wasn't war. This was something worse. A son he never knew existed. The letter gave no details, no explanations, just a name and a connection. But it was enough to set his world off balance. For the first time in years, Jake Callahan didn't know what to do next. Jake stared at the letter for what felt like hours. His coffee had gone cold, the last sip sitting untouched in his mug. The radio in the background kept playing some old Tom Petty song, but he wasn't listening. His mind was trapped in the past, somewhere between the memory of Emily Carter's voice and the weight of the words in front of him. "She told me you're my father." How the hell was that possible? Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple with a calloused hand. He had been careful, always had been. He never wanted to leave behind something unfinished, especially not like this, but the timeline made sense. If this kid, Luke, was in his 20s now, that lined up with the last time he saw Emily. They were young then, stupid, caught up in the reckless heat of things before he shipped out. He had never imagined she was pregnant. Why hadn't she told him? Jake pushed back his chair abruptly, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. His movements were sharp, military, precise, even though his mind was a storm of uncertainty. He grabbed the letter again, reading it one more time, as if the words might change, as if there would be some fine print at the bottom saying, "Just kidding, don't worry about it." But there wasn't. He needed answers. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he moved to the corner of his cabin where a locked metal box sat beneath a bookshelf. He knelt down, entered the combination, and lifted the lid. Inside were neatly organized documents, service records, personal letters, a few faded photos from his time in the Marines. He flipped through them quickly until his fingers landed on a small, creased envelope. Emily Carter. He pulled it out and unfolded the letter inside, reading words written in looping, familiar handwriting. "Jake, I don't expect you to write back. I just wanted you to know I'm doing fine. I know you have your own path, and I'm not going to stand in the way of it, but if you ever come through Dallas again, maybe stop by and say hi." Dallas. That was the last thing he ever heard from her. He never went back, never wrote back. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that decision settle in his chest. He stood up and grabbed his keys off the counter. If Emily was gone, there was only one person left who could give him the truth. Luke. He didn't know anything about him, not his age, not his face, not his life. But Jake knew one thing for certain. He had spent his whole life prepared for battles he could see coming. This one, he never saw it coming at all. Jake Callahan had never been the type to hesitate. In the Marines, hesitation got people killed. But now, standing in his small, cluttered living room, he found himself stuck between the past and the unknown future. The letter sat on the coffee table, its words burned into his mind. His son, a kid he never knew about, walking around somewhere out there, carrying a name Jake had never spoken. He exhaled sharply and grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. He needed information. His first instinct was to call someone. An old contact, maybe, someone who could help him track down this Luke. But the truth was, he didn't even know where to start. Emily Carter was the only connection he had to the boy, and she was gone. Jake's hands flexed around his truck keys as he headed outside. The evening air was thick, warm, carrying the scent of pine and dust. He had spent the past few years here, tucked away in the quiet of the Texas countryside, trying to build a life that didn't require orders, tactics, or an enemy. But now he was moving again, slipping back into the mindset of a man on a mission. He climbed into his old Ford pickup, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. His first stop, the town library. It wasn't the high-tech government-level intel he was used to, but it was a start. He needed records, newspaper clippings, something to tell him where Emily had been in the past 2 decades. Maybe an obituary, maybe a birth announcement, anything that could fill in the missing years. The drive into town was quiet, except for the sound of his own thoughts echoing in his head. He gripped the wheel tighter as memories resurfaced. He had been young when he met Emily, just a fresh Marine on a short leave before deployment. He remembered her laughter, the way she danced without music, how she never let anyone tell her what to do. She had been wild in a way that made sense to him back then. He had always assumed she moved on, found someone new, started a life of her own. But apparently she had started a life for both of them. Jake pulled into the parking lot of the small library, stepping out of the truck with purposeful strides. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and dust, and the only sound was the distant hum of a ceiling fan. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a bun, looked up from her desk. "Evening," Jake greeted, keeping his voice steady. "Evening," she responded, eyeing him curiously. "I need to find some old records, births, deaths, anything that might help me track down someone from a couple decades ago." She raised an eyebrow. "You looking for family?" Jake hesitated, then with a slow nod he admitted, "Yeah, something like that." The librarian studied him for a moment before gesturing toward the far end of the room. "Microfilm's over there. If you got a name, you might get lucky." He did have a name, Luke Carter. And if the boy was really his son, then Jake was about to find out just how much time he had lost. The glow of the microfilm machine cast a dull blue light over the table, illuminating years of faded newspaper articles and public records. Jake Callahan sat hunched forward, scanning each frame with an intensity that came from years of experience. His fingers turned the dial slowly, searching for anything, any mention of Emily Carter, any sign of Luke. The rhythmic clicking of the machine was the only sound in the quiet corner of the library. His mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The soldier in him wanted to tackle this like a mission. identify the target, gather intelligence, move forward. But the man wasn't ready for what he might find. Then something... The article was small, barely more than a paragraph in the Dallas Morning News, dated 18 years ago. Emily Carter, a beloved nurse at St. Jude's Children's Hospital, passed away unexpectedly at the age of 39. She is survived by her son, Luke Carter, age 6. Jake sat back, staring at the words. Emily had died young, gone before she ever had the chance to reach out to tell him the truth. His chest tightened, not just from the loss, but from the finality of it. He had been too late for answers from her. But there was still Luke. Age 6, that meant he'd be in his 20s now, grown, a man. Jake took out his phone and typed in Luke Carter, Dallas, TX. A list of names popped up, but none gave him a clear lead. There were hundreds of Luke Carters in Texas alone. He needed more. He pushed away from the microphone reader and approached the librarian again. She looked up from her novel, raising an eyebrow. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Part of it," Jake admitted. "Emily Carter. She worked at St. Jude's Hospital, passed away years ago. I need to find out more about her son." The librarian tapped her pen on the desk thoughtfully. If she worked at St. Jude's, someone there might remember her. Hospitals keep old employment records. Might be worth checking. Jake nodded. "Appreciate it." He was already moving toward the exit when her voice stopped him. "Hey." Jake turned back. "You seem like a man who doesn't back down from things," she said carefully. "Just be sure you know what you're looking for before you go knocking on doors." Her words hung in the air as he stepped outside, the night pressing in around him. Jake had spent his life chasing ghosts in combat zones. Now, he was chasing something far more personal, and for the first time in years he felt truly unprepared. Jake Callahan wasn't a man who let questions go unanswered. He had spent too many years in the Marines, navigating intelligence reports and tracking down insurgents to let a lead slip through his fingers. This was no different. Except it was. This wasn't about war or strategy. This was about a kid who never knew his father. A kid who might still be out there. Jake's truck rumbled to life as he pulled out of the library parking lot, the dark Texas sky stretching endlessly above him. His hands tightened around the wheel as he made his way toward St. Jude's Children's Hospital, the last place Emily had worked. If anyone could tell him where Luke had gone, it would be someone there. He hadn't been to Dallas in years. Too many ghosts. Too many memories of old friends who never made it home. Now the city lights glowed ahead of him, distant but growing brighter as he approached. He kept the radio off, his mind running through possibilities. What if Luke didn't want to be found? What if he had been told lies about Jake, stories of a father who abandoned him? What if he wasn't even alive? Jake forced those thoughts down, one step at a time. By the time he pulled into the hospital parking lot, the place was winding down for the night. A few nurses walked toward their cars, exhausted after long shifts, while the glow from the front entrance cast a soft light across the pavement. Jake stepped out of his truck, adjusted his worn leather jacket, and walked inside. The front desk clerk, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Miriam, looked up as he approached. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but guarded. "I hope so," Jake said, placing his hands on the counter. "I'm trying to find some information on a former employee. Emily Carter? She worked here about 18 years ago." Miriam frowned slightly. Emily Carter, that name sounds familiar. She turned to her computer, fingers clicking against the keys as she searched the system. After a moment, she nodded. "Yes, she was a nurse here. Passed away some years back, right?" "Yeah," Jake said, clearing his throat. "She had a son. Luke Carter. I need to find him." Miriam hesitated, studying him carefully. "Are you family?" Jake took a slow breath. "I think I might be his father." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth. Foreign. Heavy. Miriam's expression softened, but she still looked cautious. am not sure I can give out personal information like that, Mr. Callahan. Jake Callahan. She nodded. Look, I can't just hand out records, but I can tell you this. Emily was well loved here. She was a damn good nurse, and she talked about her son all the time. He was everything to her. Jake's throat tightened. You don't know where he is? He asked. Miriam sighed. Last I heard, after Emily passed, Luke bounced around a bit. I think he stayed with a family friend, maybe an old neighbor of theirs. But I don't know where he ended up. Jake exhaled. Another dead end. Then Miriam glanced around as if making sure no one was listening, before scribbling something on a piece of paper and sliding it across the desk. This is the number of an old nurse who used to work with Emily, she said quietly. Her name's Linda. If anyone knows where Luke is, it's her. Jake picked up the paper, nodding his thanks. Appreciated, he said. Miriam gave him a small smile. Good luck, Mr. Callahan. Jake turned and walked back toward the exit, gripping the slip of paper like it was a mission briefing. One more lead. One step closer. And yet, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. Sitting in his truck outside the hospital, Jake Callahan turned the small slip of paper over in his fingers. The name Linda was scrawled in neat, careful handwriting, followed by a phone number. It felt strange, holding onto something so small that carried the weight of so many years. For the past 24 hours, his life had gone from predictable solitude to a chase for a ghost, a son he never knew existed. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. A deep breath. Then, with a practiced steadiness, he dialed. The line rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. Hello? Linda? Jake kept his tone calm, steady, the way he always did when navigating unknown terrain. Yes, who's this? My name's Jake Callahan. I was given your number by a nurse at St. Jude's. She said you used to work with Emily Carter. Silence. A brief hesitation, just long enough to make him wonder if she was going to hang up. Then a slow, measured breath on the other end. Yeah, Linda finally said. I knew Emily. Who are you? Jake hesitated. It was a simple question, but he wasn't sure of the answer himself. He swallowed, then straightened. I served with Emily's father. We knew each other a long time ago. I just found out she had a son. Luke. Another pause. You mean your son? Lyndon said. Jake's grip on the phone tightened. She told you? Linda sighed, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. Emily always planned on telling you, but by the time she was ready, you were already gone. And then life happened, and she convinced herself you were better off not knowing. She didn't want to be the reason you felt tied down. Jake leaned back against his seat, his jaw tightening. Better off not knowing? I had a right to know, he said quietly, his voice edged with something raw. I think she realized that too late, Linda admitted. But I also know she never once regretted having Luke. He was her whole world, Jake. She worked extra shifts, did everything she could to give him a good life. Jake closed his eyes. He could picture Emily, young, determined, that fire in her eyes. She had never been the type to ask for help. Maybe she really had believed she was doing the right thing. Where is he now? Jake asked, forcing himself back to the present. Linda hesitated again. Jake? Luke's had a rough life. After Emily passed, he went into the foster system for a while. It wasn't easy for him. He bounced from house to house, never really belonging anywhere. But he's tough, got through it. Last I heard, he was in Fort Worth working construction. Jake nodded slowly, committing every detail to memory. Do you have an address? No, Linda admitted. But I know he used to go to a place called Charlie's Garage. It's a small auto shop on the west side of town. He worked there for a bit. You might be able to find someone who knows where he is. Jake exhaled. A lead. Thank you, he said, and for the first time he meant it. Jake, Linda said before he could hang up, if you do find him, don't expect him to welcome you with open arms. Luke's been let down by a lot of people. He's not the same kid Emily raised." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. "I wouldn't expect anything less." He ended the call and stared out at the dark stretch of highway ahead. Charlie's garage? It wasn't much, but it was enough. Tomorrow he was going to find his son. The next morning, Jake Callahan was already behind the wheel of his truck before the sun had fully risen. He wasn't used to waiting around for answers, and he wasn't about to start now. The address Linda had given him, Charlie's garage, wasn't far from downtown Fort Worth, a small, worn-down shop tucked away between an old laundromat and a liquor store. He'd spent years navigating dangerous terrain, but something about this felt different. This wasn't about strategy. This was personal. Pulling into the lot, he took a slow scan of the area. A few cars sat haphazardly parked outside, a rusted tow truck near the entrance, and the unmistakable sound of metal tools clanking echoed from inside. The place was small, the kind of garage that probably did honest work for cheap. No frills. No overcharging. Jake stepped out, adjusting his worn leather jacket, and made his way inside. The scent of motor oil and grease clung to the air, mixing with the scent of burnt coffee from an old pot sitting on the counter. A man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard and overalls glanced up from under the hood of a car. "You need something fixed?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm looking for someone," Jake said, voice steady. "Luke Carter." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a slight pause in his movement, just enough for Jake to notice. "Luke?" the man asked, feigning indifference. "Don't think I know him." Jake narrowed his eyes. He had dealt with enough people in his life to know when someone was dodging a question. "Name's Jake Callahan," he said, stepping closer. "I just want to talk to him. That's all." The older man studied him for a moment before letting out a slow sigh. "Look, even if I did know where Luke was, I'm not sure he'd want to see anyone coming to look for him. He doesn't exactly keep in touch with people." "Just tell me if he worked here," Jake pressed. The man hesitated, then finally nodded. "Yeah, he was here for a while. Did solid work. Kid knew his way around an engine." He paused, rubbing his jaw. "But he left about a year ago." Jake's stomach tightened. "Where'd he go?" "Not sure," the man admitted. "But last I heard he was hanging around a bar on the other side of town. Riley's Tavern, one of those places where people go when they don't want to be found." Jake clenched his jaw. That didn't sit well. A bar like that? It meant Luke wasn't just trying to lay low, he was hiding. "You sure he's still around?" The mechanic shrugged. "If he's not, someone there will know where he went." Jake exhaled slowly. Another lead, another step closer. "Appreciate it," he said, turning to leave. "Hey," the mechanic called after him. Jake stopped, glancing over his shoulder. "If you do find him," the man said carefully, "just go easy on the kid. He's been through a lot. Not sure how he's going to take someone like you showing up." Jake nodded once. He had expected as much. But it didn't matter. He was going to find Luke, no matter what it took. The neon glow of Riley's Tavern flickered against a damp pavement, casting a dull red haze across the cracked asphalt. Jake Callahan pulled his truck into the lot, cutting the engine but not stepping out right away. He had spent years walking into places just like this, some halfway across the world in war zones where a man could get himself killed for looking the wrong way. But this was different. This time he wasn't tracking an enemy, he was searching for blood, his own. He rolled his shoulders, then stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the entrance. The moment he walked inside, the air changed. The smell of stale beer mixed with sweat and cigarette smoke. The low hum of conversation punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the clink of pool balls colliding. Jake scanned the room. Dim lighting, cracked vinyl booths, a long wooden bar lined with stools, a few rough-looking men in denim jackets and work boots, a group of younger guys throwing darts at a battered board, and a tired-looking bartender wiping down the counter. He walked straight to the bar. The bartender, a man in his 60s with a grizzled beard and a deep scar running down his cheek, barely looked up. "Wobbleby." Information. Jake rested his hands against the worn wood, looking for someone. Luke Carter. The bartender stopped wiping the glass in his hands. His gaze lifted, meeting Jake's with an unreadable expression. Never heard of him. Jake smirked. He had heard that line 1,000 times before. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it clear he wasn't here for games. "Not in the mood for the runaround," he said. "I just need to talk to him." The bartender's lips pressed into a thin line. "And if he doesn't want to talk?" "Then I'll walk away." A long silence stretched between them before the bartender exhaled heavily and tilted his head toward the back of the bar. Last booth. Jake followed the motion and turned. And there he was. A young man sat in the booth, leaning forward, arms resting on the table, dark hair that fell just past his ears, tired eyes that carried more weight than any 20-something should. A beer bottle sat untouched in front of him, and his fingers drummed absent-mindedly against the glass. Jake took a step closer. Luke looked up. For a second, just a second, Jake swore he saw Emily's eyes staring back at him. That same quiet fire, that same guarded expression. Then the younger man's face hardened. "Who the hell are you?" Luke asked, voice flat, skeptical. Jake swallowed, steadying himself, but there was no way to soften it. "I'm your father." The words landed between them like a thunderclap. Luke's expression didn't change, but his hands curled into fists. And just like that, Jake knew this was going to be the hardest fight of his life. For a moment the noise of Riley's tavern disappeared. The clinking glasses, the murmured conversations, the laughter. It all faded into a heavy silence between Jake and Luke. The younger man's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. His eyes, Emily's eyes, were locked onto Jake's with a coldness that sent a sharp pain through his chest. "You're lying," Luke said, his voice low, controlled, but there was a tremor in it, a crack in the armor. Jake shook his head. "No, I just found out. I didn't know about you, Luke. Not until now." Luke let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head as he leaned back in the booth. "Bullshit." He reached for the beer bottle in front of him, lifting it slightly before setting it back down, untouched. His fingers tapped against the glass. "Restless? Agitated? You think you can just walk in here and say that after 24 years? Jake exhaled slowly. He expected this. Hell, he would have reacted the same way if their roles were reversed. I didn't know," he repeated. "If I had, You what?" Luke snapped, eyes flashing. "You'd have been there? You'd have been some great dad who threw a football in the yard and came to all my school plays?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "Man, get the hell out of here with that." Jake felt every word like a punch to the ribs, but he didn't flinch. "I don't expect anything from you," he said, voice steady. "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm just here. That's it." Luke laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah? Where were you when my mom died?" His voice wavered, and for the first time Jake saw the raw, unfiltered pain beneath all that anger. "Where were you when I bounced from one shitty foster home to the next? Where were you when I had to fight my way through life with no one looking out for me?" Jake didn't have an answer for that. He could have said that he was overseas, serving his country, fighting battles in places Luke had probably never even heard of. But that didn't matter. None of it mattered. "I can't change the past," Jake admitted. "And I can't undo what you went through, but I can stand here right now and tell you the truth. I didn't know, but I know now, and I'm not walking away." Luke's hands curled into fists. His chest rose and fell sharply, his breath uneven. He looked away, staring at the scratched-up table, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, suddenly, he stood. "Yeah, well, I don't need you," Luke muttered, stepping out of the booth. Jake's stomach tightened. He knew this moment was fragile. One wrong move and he might never get another chance. "Luke," he said firmly. The younger man paused, but didn't turn around. "You don't have to need me," Jake said, but that doesn't mean I'm going anywhere." Luke exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. For a second, Jake thought he was going to walk out. Instead, Luke turned back, his expression unreadable. "You want to prove something? Be at Tucker's lot tomorrow, noon. No more words." Then, without another glance, he walked out the door. Jake watched him go, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he would be there, no matter what. The next day, Jake Callahan pulled his truck into Tucker's lot, a wide stretch of land on the outskirts of town. It looked like an old dirt field where kids probably raced four-wheelers or held late-night bonfires. The sky was overcast, the air thick with a smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Luke was already there. He stood with his arms crossed, wearing a worn-out leather jacket over a plain gray t-shirt. His posture was guarded, his expression unreadable. But Jake could tell, this wasn't just some meeting spot. This was a test. "You actually showed," Luke said, voice edged with disbelief. Jake shut off the engine and climbed out of the truck. "I told you I would." Luke scoffed. "Yeah, well, people have said that to me before." Jake nodded, stepping closer. "I get it. I wouldn't trust me either." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, not quite tense, but not easy either. Then Luke exhaled sharply and looked away, shaking his head. "I don't know what you expect from this man. I don't know you, and honestly, I don't think I want to." Jake's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Fair enough." Luke frowned like he had expected more of a fight. "That's it?" "I can't make you want to know me," Jake said simply, "and I'm not going to stand here and tell you I deserve anything. But I'm here. That's all I've got." Luke ran a hand through his hair, frustration and something else, something closer to exhaustion flashing across his face. "You don't get it, do you? You showing up now? It doesn't change anything?" Jake took a slow breath. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I'm not going to disappear just because it's easier for you to walk away." Luke let out a bitter laugh. "Why? Because you feel guilty? Because you suddenly decided to be a father 24 years too late?" Jake didn't flinch. "Because I know what it's like to be alone. And if you think for 1 second I'm going to let you go through that when I can change it, you're dead wrong." Luke's jaw clenched. He looked away, swallowing hard. "I don't need saving," he muttered. "I never said you did," Jake replied. "I just need you to know you're not alone." The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of a car passing on the highway. For the first time, Luke didn't immediately fire back. He just stood there, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on the dirt beneath his boots. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a slow breath. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, voice quieter now. Jake nodded. "Neither do I. But we don't have to figure it out today." Luke hesitated, then glanced up at him. "Yeah?" "Yeah," Jake said, "one step at a time." Another pause, then almost reluctantly Luke nodded. "All right." It wasn't much, but it was a start.